and welcome to this presentation on the deaf community and deaf culture. It is important to note that there is a strong correlation between the deaf community and deaf culture. Deaf communities are situated worldwide. Each deaf community is comprised of individuals who seek to support, recognize, and increase awareness for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. Furthermore, the deaf community assists individuals with respective communication disabilities and their corresponding complications. Individuals represented within the deaf community include deaf or hard of hearing individuals, people who become deaf early in life, hearing friends, family members, and those that work with deaf people, such as interpreters, audiologists, and community workers. Before going into depth about deaf culture, I thought I would share an interesting idea by Mitchell and Snyder in 1996, who suggest that disability culture is essential to survive as an oppressed minority, both mentally and physically. So what is deaf culture? Deaf culture is very diverse within communities around the world. This is due to various values, morals, experiences, and history that each deaf individual has. Due to such a large variance throughout a deaf individual's background and exposure, there is also a variance reflected in the culture and community that they are a part of. People who are deaf or hard of hearing often deal with several stereotypes from hearing individuals, such as the misconception that they are a languageless, disabled community. Due to such misconceptions, common goals throughout deaf culture attempt to form unity between members of the deaf community itself and also towards hearing individuals. This is due to the belief that deaf communities are a microcosm of national identity, and that unity will result in enhanced relationships and knowledge of diverse individuals with different experiences. Common elements and beliefs which assist the formation of deaf culture include the idea that being deaf should not be considered a disability, the term deaf should be referred to as deaf gain, that being deaf should be embraced by deaf and hearing individuals to enhance unity and knowledge. In summary, culture forms unity and a way of responding to the hurtful stereotypes surrounding the deaf and the deaf community. An effective method to determine the size of the deaf community is to explore the number of sign language users for a given population. It is estimated that there are about 70 million deaf individuals who use sign language as their first language around the world. In Australia, however, the deaf community consists of approximately 30,000 individuals who use Auslan as their sign language. In order to compare and contrast lived experiences of deaf individuals, at least two first-hand accounts must be examined to determine similarities and differences between their respective experiences of being deaf. Each individual experiences and expresses their own personal experiences differently. The first member of the deaf community is 36-year-old Julia Gilchrist, who was born profoundly deaf in both ears. As no other family member were born deaf, Julia grew up in a world where she assumed everyone didn't hear anything and that communication was via reading lips. Julia has utilized her hearing devices for the majority of her life and received her cochlear implant before turning 21. Which enabled her to blend in and feel like everyone else with no disadvantages. Julia has felt like an outsider, in the way simple daily tasks become difficult due to her disability. Simple activities like ordering a coffee or simple work demands become difficult due to being deaf. Throughout schooling, making mistakes were followed by severe social consequences. Julia was always concerned about what others thought of her, and due to her ability to lip read, she found out very quickly what these opinions were, which impacted her negatively. For Julia, the negatives of being deaf have outweighed the positives throughout her life. This is due to the constant belief that she is behind her year group, and that it took her first 33 years to develop a sense of identity. Furthermore, Julia has had approximately 25 to 30 jobs due to her being deaf within a workplace, which is very alienating for Julia as she wants to settle in and blend into the work environment. Although the social impacts haven't stopped throughout Julia's life, being deaf has shaped her mental toughness and resilience. Other advantages include the ability to turn off the hearing device and have a rest on conversations and noise. Although Julia has experienced several disadvantages, she still has the view that being deaf shouldn't restrict her identity or the relationships she should have with others. The second member of the deaf community is David Biggs, who has used hearing devices throughout the majority of his life, including hearing aids and now a cochlear implant. Here is what David had to say about his own personal lived experiences.
Hello, my name is David Biggs and I am 57 years old and I was born profoundly deaf. It was picked up at an early age as my brother was also born deaf. After approaching the specialist, my parents put us in a very small private school in New Zealand. This is when I first realised I was different. I was different in the way that I was often approached as I had a speech impediment. People wouldn't realise that I was actually deaf. I didn't really see myself as disadvantaged, but understand why other deaf individuals would. Lived experiences throughout my life involved many advantages and disadvantages. In group situations, I would tend to not hear the punchline or the end of a conversation, and when I asked, I would be told that it wouldn't matter and felt excluded. People would often claim that they had told me something and that I didn't listen to what they said, when, because I am deaf, I would take particular care to make sure I got the message correctly. They would say, "He doesn't listen." At times, it is these particular statements made by others that have made me feel excluded, disadvantaged. Before subtitles were introduced, I rarely watched TV except for live sport. Although there are many perceived disadvantages, there are also many positive experiences for being profoundly deaf. These include when you go to sleep at night and take the hearing device out, there is no weather disruptions resulting in great sleep. As a result of being profoundly deaf, I didn't speak as much whilst at work, which resulted in me being a better, more effective worker. In sport, as a rugby player, it was helpful that I couldn't hear people coming when I was under the high ball, or in other words, intense pressure. I understand that a lot of deaf people feel excluded and left out, but I only had positive experiences at school and was not considered special in a negative way, but in a positive way, and was treated equally amongst all the other students. Overall, my personal lived experience have fluctuated throughout life. However, I have always had a positive outlook and do not feel any more disadvantaged than the normal hearing person.
Similarities shared between David and Julia include: it is evident that both individuals were born profoundly deaf in both ears. Both Julia and David have used hearing aids and now both use cochlear implants, which have made a tremendous impact on both of their lives. However, one thing they share in common is the tendency to turn off the cochlear implant or hearing aid to have a rest from the conversation or external noise. Both individuals felt excluded throughout interactions at school, Julia more so than David, as she describes herself as a people's person. Both individuals share the view that being deaf shouldn't restrict their identity or the relationships they should have with others. Differences between David and Julia include: there are differences within the way both David and Julia were raised as a child. David has a brother who is deaf, whereas Julia is the only deaf member of her family. This enables David to directly relate and share common experiences with his brother, whereas Julia grew up in a world where she assumed everyone didn't hear sound. Julia has had 25 to 30 jobs and is felt unwanted in the workplace. David, however, is the opposite, as being deaf enables him to concentrate on work without being distracted from external sound. Unlike David, Julia feels like an outsider and feels like she is behind her age bracket, as being deaf has had a massive influence on her life. David, however, suggested he felt special in a positive way at school, and due to high levels of education and equality from students throughout schooling, he was never behind his age bracket. In summary and evaluation, deaf individuals display similarities and distinctly different experiences with regard to their interactions with people, understanding of their surroundings, and the way in which they exist within an academic environment. This can be seen throughout the similarities and differences between David and Julia's lived experiences.